I'm Danny Epperson, inside the Grand Commodore Dinner Theater in downtown Portsmouth. Thanks for joining me for WHRO Cinema 15 and our presentation of 1944's Jane Eyre. What do you get when you combine a classic of 19th century literature with some of the biggest filmmaking talents of 1940s Hollywood? A Victorian Gothic romance horror story that you'll never forget. Jane Eyre is the 1944 film adaptation of Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel. It tells the story of Jane Eyre, an orphan with a tragically difficult childhood who grows up to become a governess for a baron in northern England.
Well, Miss Eyre, have you no tongue?
I was waiting, sir, until I was spoken.
Very proper.
Jane develops a crush on her mysterious and moody employer, Mr. Rochester.
Good night, Jane.
Good night, sir.
Bronte drew from her own life when writing Jane Eyre. She once worked as a governess and taught at a boarding school where she became smitten with the school's headmaster. Her real-life love story didn't pan out, but the fictional version has become eternal. In 1944, this was the 5th film adaptation of Jane Eyre. This time, it was Gone with the Wind producer David O. Selznick's idea to bring Bronte's book back to the big screen. Selznick had director Robert Stevenson, a screenplay by John Houseman and Aldous Huxley, and Joan Fontaine, fresh from her Best Actress win for Hitchcock's 1941 thriller Suspicion.
I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing, but I love you.
But he needed a Rochester. In 1942, Orson Welles was still famous as the filmmaker who wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the 1941 masterpiece Citizen Kane. But after a falling out with RKO Studios, he needed money for a personal film project. Welles agreed to take the role for $100,000 and served as an uncredited producer. Jane Eyre was the first time Welles had acted for another director, and surrendering complete control didn't come naturally. Joan Fontaine said later, quote, "You can't battle an elephant. Orson was such a big man in every way that no one could stand up to him." Welles wasn't the only big personality in this movie. Keep a lookout for an 11-year-old Elizabeth Taylor, who makes an unbilled appearance in one of her earliest film roles. I'll be back after the movie to tell you about what this film has in common with dancing penguins and an anthropomorphic Volkswagen. But for now, dim the oil lamps, blow out the candelabra, and get ready for 1944's Jane Eyre. Can Gothic romantic horror stories really have happy endings? I guess this one did. Not only did Charlotte Bronte draw from her own infatuation while working as a governess, but Edward Rochester's first wife is reportedly inspired by a real-life madwoman in the attic. The author visited a medieval manor house and was shown a room where a century before, a Mad Mary was locked away from Britain's upper class. Contributing screenwriter Aldous Huxley wrote the scenes that kept Mrs. Rochester's face concealed. He claimed that allowing the audience to use their imagination would make the character more menacing. His clever scripting also circumvented British censorship regulations on the depiction of madness. For many Bronte purists, the prominence of Rochester's character throughout the movie was also a deviation from the novel. Some say that Welles was too powerful for the part, but if you struggled with Welles as the romantic lead, the list of Jane Eyre remakes is a long one, and there are plenty of other Rochesters to choose from. You've got George C. Scott in 1970, future James Bond Timothy Dalton in 1983, William Hurt in 1996, and Michael Fassbender in 2011, just to name a few. We don't even have time to talk about the Jane Eyre movies made in India, Hong Kong, Egypt, and Mexico. But among that long list, Robert Stevenson's 1944 version remains a classic. The accomplished British director changed gears in the last decades of his career. In 1956, Stevenson went to work for Walt Disney and directed 19 films in 20 years, including one that featured another famous governess, Mary Poppins.
For a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Also on his resume, an impressive list of family classics, including The Absent-Minded Professor, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, That Darn Cat, and The Love Bug. All very different from Jane Eyre, but equally unforgettable. I'm Danny Epperson, and I'll see you next week for WHRO Cinema 15 and another classic movie. I'm Danny Epperson. Here's a classic movie quiz. 1943's Jane Eyre stars Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine.
Well, Miss Eyre, have you no tongue?
I was waiting, sir, until I was spoken.
Very proper.
What future star did not receive a credit for her role in the film?
I'm not afraid, Jane.
Elizabeth Taylor. You provide the popcorn, the couch, and the TV. We'll provide great movies like Jane Eyre. Watch Cinema 15 Saturday night at 8 on WHRO TV 15.